I've been going since.
All right, it's time to get started. I don't want to take any time away from today. So plan for today is a review session for the exam for tomorrow. I've basically decided that even if questions run pretty dry, that I don't really want to tackle too much new content the day before. So I'm just going to sit here and awkwardly stare at people until I get a question, and then I'll answer the question and then can continue to awkwardly stare at people. So what kinds of questions do we have that I could answer ahead of exam tomorrow? Yeah.
How many questions are there?
So one, it's not completely totally finalized. It probably is in that I'm 90% happy with this. And I've talked to my friend for about 2 hours so far about how do I become 100% happy with it. I don't know if I can.
How many questions are there so far?
We've been adding questions, we've been modifying existing questions, structuring something of the sort, but quite a few. So it's in kind of the same types of sections that the study guide is in, where each section has to do with some block that we've talked about. And then broken down into subsections. Some of those subsections have subsections.
So a lot of short answers or like?
Yes.
Yeah. It's like there's a lot of.
Mostly very short answers, but a lot of those short answers have and explain kinds of, so how deep you go into that explanation will change how things are.
Are any of the questions outside the scope of the?
No. Yeah, if you prepare based on the study guide, there's nothing that will. Yeah, I'll revise the no to the questions that I wrote target the same outcomes as the questions on the study guide. So I'm not going to be copying and pasting questions from the study guide necessarily, but there won't be something that wasn't on the study guide, because how I make the exams is I go through the study guide and I get inspired. So I make the study guide by going through the slides, and I will say, all right, based on this material, what seems like an interesting type of question to ask? And that becomes those generic questions that are on the study guide. Then I go through the study guide and I say, what if these questions are really interesting, and what can I do with them? How can I ask you something that makes you think based on that? So I want to make you think. Even if you know the definition of something, I want you to have to interpret that in some capacity, or critically analyze the connections between elements and talk about that, or something like that. But if you've prepared yourself to think about the answers to the questions that are on the study guide, you should, off the top of your head, be able to come up with something to answer most of these questions based on your own experience, based on the games that you played, based on the games that you would like to make. So there will be some, you will have to come up with some stuff for that, but it won't be, you won't be pulling it out of nothing. You'll be pulling it out of some kind of inspiration to tackle the question. That's kind of vague, but.
I'm sorry, I got distracted by the trading cards. How many questions do you say was?
So there are, I think, 5 larger sections, and in the worst case, I think there are 12 subsections to one of those.
How many questions for something?
For that, there would only be 1 question per subsection, but sometimes there are 2 subsections, each with 3 smaller questions. And some of the times those lead into each other. So like, for instance, there's one of the ways that you might see something like that evolve is MDA is related to each other. So I might have you go from M to D to A, or from A to D to M from one of those perspectives, and go through how does one lead to the other. That would be a way that I could break that down into how do you get dynamics from mechanics from the player's perspective. How do you get from aesthetics to dynamics from the designer's perspective? Something like that.
I'm pretty sure you said that we could before, but we're allowed to have notes, right?
Yes, you have a sheet of notes, front and back. I'm not gonna collect it. You can type it, you can write it, you can copy and paste the slides and print them out. I do not care. The idea is that there's at least the work that you do for that will help you prepare in some capacity. If I make an exam open notes, then what happens is people don't prepare in advance and they assume my notes are going to save me while I'm taking the exam. And that eats time. I usually write exams to take close to the amount of time that we have if you are prepared. So the concept of getting all of that on the sheet of notes will make it so that you're quick when it comes to taking the exam and you have the ideas. You don't have to look something up. You just thought about it as you put it on the sheet. Maybe you need to do a quick lookup, but you don't have to think, what was that? And then read everything from the class, think about it for a while to come up with what is that? Now, how do I use it? We want to minimize the amount of time that it takes for you to recall anything that is a lookup from something in the class. So that should be on your sheet of notes because you'll need to know what it is to be able to answer a question that says something like, come up with an example that does something. I'm not going to ask you, what is the M in MDA? I will ask you for an example. I will ask you for design a game or use an existing game. What is the M in that game? Give me some examples. Something like more like that involves, you know what it is, now apply it to something. So the what it is on the paper is really the prerequisite to being successful to the question.
I'm a little fuzzy on emergence. I think I understand it, but that kind of got.
Yeah. So emergence is really the concept of we have rules. What happens when players play with those rules? When different players play the same game, it goes differently. Let's use the concept of what we were talking about in my office earlier, Monopoly. Very competitive people sitting around Monopoly playing Monopoly. Now we have a bunch of 4-year-olds sitting around playing Monopoly. The emergence of what happens, the dynamics, what is it like to be playing that game is very different depending on who is interpreting those rules and what those players are trying to get out of it. So you might make rules where the emergence from that is more competitive in nature. So you can design something that competitive players will want to play because it makes them feel competitive and allows them to experience their desire of competition. You could design some rules where the emergence from that is more cooperative, or the emergence is more immersive. The emergence is more analytical. But what happens when those rules become gameplay? And I love this. One of the ways someone in my office described this was something like, the mechanics are like the rules, but the dynamics are more like the runtime behavior. You have the code, and then you have what does the code do when it's being run by a particular user or on a particular system, or so what happens as it's being run a particular time. That's more the dynamic, the emergence from that. You're playing a game with set rules, but it changes based on who you're playing with, how the game is going this time. It feels very different when someone is rolling and hitting every single ladder in Snakes and Ladders from someone who is hitting all snakes. Different passes through that game, the emergence from that can be different on a game-to-game basis. Dynamics that emerge from those rules can change. Yeah.
So kind of like also with the Snakes and Ladders, how in some cases, someone could just hit all the ladders, the snakes, and just zoom up to the top, and someone else could have the exact opposite, hit all the ladders and all the.
Yeah. And the other example to this would be, imagine the difference between playing, to get a sense of how good this example will be, who's played a single game of Magic the Gathering before? All right, this will not be the best example. But you can imagine take the knowledge of a game, a complicated game that you are an expert in, and a complicated game that you are not an expert in. You can imagine the difference between you're sitting down and playing with a world expert at that game. Maybe we can use chess as an example. Sitting down and playing chess with someone who is an ELO 2200 chess player versus someone who has just learned how a pawn moves. It's a very different emergent experience to be playing that game when you're fighting for your life, knowing that no matter what I do, this person knows what I'm going to do before I do it, or that's how it feels when you play the game. That's different emergence from, no, you can't move that piece there. That's against the rules. You could move it here, and then they say, okay, I'm going to do that. But do you really want to do that? Now you have to decide, do I play optimally or do I try to play for that person's fun as they're learning the rules? Again, a very different emergent experience for you as you play that game. So from a designer's perspective, how do you design for that different kind of emergence? How do you design for what is it like to play with a kid? What is it like to play with an expert? Is it meant to really only be played by someone with equal skill level, or is it snakes and ladders? There are no world experts at snakes and ladders. It's a coin flip. Yet, maybe with some of our rules that we invented. But depending on the game, depending on how you think of it, how you design it, the kinds of emergence that are possible vary. Questions? Other questions?
Some of the questions from your study guide are very open-ended.
Yes.
Is there something in particular you're looking for from those that we should keep in mind as we're writing them?
Not necessarily. If something that I give you is open-ended, it's because I want to hear your thoughts on the process. There's not one right answer. I'm not trying to funnel you to one right answer. I'm trying to engage critical thinking. And the grade, even on an exam, would be based on, are you tying it to the concepts that we have talked about in class? And does your idea have some merit? Can I understand where you are coming from? Even if I disagree with you, you will probably still get full credit if you're tying it and it's like, I don't know if that would work. I don't think that would work, but I would need you to design the game and play it to really know, but it's a question worth asking. Game design is very artistic in that sense, that there isn't one right answer. And even if I think I know the right answer to something, I may be wrong. So all I can ask is that there is a reason that you think the way that you do, that you have the opinions that you do about, maybe you're designing a game and you would say, I want to design it this way to allow for this behavior. And if you walk me through that process, even if I say, I don't think that that would do that, the fact that you're tying it to one of the concepts that we've talked about in class, I would say, yeah, that seems like a solid design principle, even if I think that maybe you don't have the level of game design experience to notice that it isn't going to work out quite the way you think it will. It's at least, it's a place to start. And the fact that you're thinking that means that the games that you design are going to be better, or that you will learn from your mistakes, because when it doesn't work out, you have something to tie it back to. So yeah, the exam questions that I write very infrequently have a right answer and a wrong answer, but I will be looking for just levels of critical analysis and tying it back to something that we've talked about in class. So making those connections and then justifying why you think the way that you do. Having reasoning for that, being able to explain that reason. And of course, everything has partial credit available as well. So because it's not right answer, wrong answer, I'll be looking for, to what extent do you explain yourself? To what extent do you tie it to class? To what extent is there an understanding of these concepts and how they relate to what you're talking about? Question?
It'd be acceptable, like, I know we talked about the MDA earlier and design, but with those ways that aren't super creative, like, I mean, just regurgitate or analyze existing games that we're
Yes.
familiar with and.
Yes. So usually if I do something like that, I will either give you a list of possible games that I know would work well with the question. If I think that just about anything would work well with the question, then I'll give you total creative freedom over that and put the burden on myself to go figure out, as you talk about these mechanics, I'll give people one piece of advice. If you're using a game as an example, describe the game like someone, like the person who's grading it has never played it before, not like you're talking to your best friend who plays it with you every day. You're going to be making some assumptions that people know things about that game, that if I haven't played the game, then I have to go do a ton of research to try to figure that out. And I'm probably not willing to do that much research. If it's a Google search or a query, sure, no problem. If it's, I have to go buy the game, download the game, play the game for 10 hours to understand what you're talking about, as much as I'd love to do that, I don't have the time to do that for everyone in the class.
I have you greater than that.
Yes, that too. And I write questions that by nature are not easy to grade. So anything that you can do in the period of time to say, to actually tie your thoughts together in a cohesive package and not just leave it very open-ended, or something that is vague that I have to interpret and try to think, what did you intend when you wrote this? I only have what's on the page. I don't have the rest of your thought process. So make sure that what you put on the page represents what you think. Completely, fully.
Are you grading this yourself or is Hunter?
So I'm gonna have Hunter do a first pass.
Okay.
And usually then I talk to Hunter and say, how did it go? How confident do you feel in, so we sit down and have a meeting ahead of time. What are we looking for? What is a good, what is a mid, what is a bad response to each question on the exam? Then I go through and I ask him after he takes a first pass, how did that go? What did that look like? Do you have any concerns about how it went? Do you feel, how confident do you feel that the grades that you assigned are perfect? And that confidence should never be 100%, but if it's high, then I do a quick pass and say, do I agree? If it is lower, then we sit down and actually go through and I will do a full pass over the grading and make the associated changes. He's here to save me a bunch of time so that I can do things like make more complicated classes. All of the design of my classes come from a lot of iteration and ideas and planning, and that's what a lot of my time is spent on, and then disgusting amounts of office hours. I love office hours. I love being able to help people in office hours. And the less grading I do, the more I can help people individually in my classes.
Can you tell us if you're going to be comparing, if you're going to ask us to compare the MDA method to the elemental tetrad?
I can't tell you that, but I would say that is something that I could do. If I did something like that, I might ask you for something like, what are some similarities between them? What are some differences between them? I probably wouldn't go more specific than that to say, tie the M from this to the inscribed layer in that. What are they? But you could, in general, just talk about thinking of them as different trains of thought for how to analyze a game. How are they similar? When would they agree on how a game is created or broken apart? Where would they disagree? Where is one more specific than the other? How is it more specific and why? Questions? Yeah. How's your day been? I am recently caffeinated, so instead of just being like, I'm alive, I'm great. In about 2 hours, I'll be back to I'm alive, I need more caffeine. Yeah, more about emergence. In what sense? What do you feel like either is confused or could use more detail associated with it? What? Yeah, I like to think of the difference between mechanics and dynamics as you go between that. That is the emergence. So the runtime behavior that is not specified by the rules, what can happen there is emergence as the rules become gameplay. What are the ways that the rules could become gameplay, and how does that differ depending on who's playing the game or who you're playing the game with?
It's a kind of dynamic.
It's the going from mechanics to dynamics. It's going from what's the actual code, what are the actual rules, to how do we, the person, engage with that? What is it doing for us? Is it allowing us to channel our inner competitiveness, to channel our inner desire for sociability? Is it there to give us a break from the stress of reality? Is it there to allow us to make optimization calculations that are challenging? Is it there to solve a puzzle? Is it there to rack your brain? Is it there to give you a sense of thrill of, I don't want to go jump out of a plane, but I could play a game that allows me to go to jump out of a plane. I don't have the money is another example of something I talked about in my office. I don't have enough money to travel to Germany, buy an expensive racing car, get a license to race that racing car on a racetrack there, and then go do that. That's a lot of time and effort and money. It's a lot cheaper to buy a game that simulates doing that. And I will get not 100%, not 50% of the thrill, but I will get some percentage of that thrill if that game is good at creating that same sense of feeling that I would get from doing that in real life.
Are you a racing sim fan?
My first game console that I ever owned was a PlayStation 2, and it came with Gran Turismo 3, which I played many hours of. So yeah, I liked it for that. I don't know if I'd call myself an enthusiast, but it's something that I engaged with enough to understand the benefit of, or the thrill of. And I may or may not have plugged in a code shark at one point and made one of the drag cars in that so fast that it tilted upwards, and you could race around a circular track with no ability to control left or right, just by sliding along the wall at something like, I don't know, 400 or 500 miles per hour. We reached pretty good close to the speed of a jet, racing around, scraping the wall. And you know, there was some fun to that as a young teenager.
You talk about, you mentioned a couple of times the player agency.
Yeah. Yeah, player agency is basically the decisions that a player has as they play the game. How much control does the player have over the outcome? So to what extent do the decisions the player makes affect the outcome of the game? A game that has high player agency will say you have a large amount of control over how the game plays out. A small amount of player agency would be snakes and ladders, the original snakes and ladders. If you roll some dice, you might as well flip a coin. There's no player agency. But in an open world, narrative driven choices matter kind of game where the actual plot evolves and branches based on the decisions that you make, that has a high amount of player agency. You can now play the game as a good guy or an evil guy, or somewhere in between, where you can start to shape your own personality and the game reacts to the decisions that you make. So that game has high player agency.
So one of the questions with the study is, why do people study ludology? Do you mean, why do people study the study of game making and game design?
Yeah.
Or why did, okay.
Yeah, so ludology is the study of games and the study of games. So why do we care to study games?
Okay,
Because-
because technically by the sentence structure, you'd be asking, why do people study the study of
Yeah.
games? And
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, so why do people study ludology? Why do people study,
partake in ludology.
partake in the study of games?
Admittedly, there's not a lot of better words for English.
Yeah.
It's like, so.
Yeah, and even if it were the study of ludology, if we're looking at ludologists, why do we care to understand what ludologists have to say? that would be valid too.
I'm just for clarification.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
can see this as a one-to-one question on the exam.
Could be.
You're making a mental note, gotta go change that one.
No, no, it's more like, I can get 2 questions out of this.
Oh, God.
No, I'm not gonna do that to you.
And then we can add recursion in there, studying people who study with all of them.
Yeah, what about the psychology of the people who study games? Can we study that? What kinds of games the people who study ludology like to play? What can we understand about how to design games for people who analyze games? Useless.
And then studying people who study ludologists.
Yeah, that becomes an infinite loop of,
Yeah.
I want to understand myself, but to understand myself, I need to abstract from myself. I can't abstract from myself, so.
With enough drugs, anyway.
Is there a topic that you think you've written more questions for that we should maybe focus on a little bit more?
That's a good question. So it's tough to break apart some of the larger chapters into distinct kinds of questions that target different aspects of that. That's a lot of what I struggled with when making the exam. So I would say if you spent more time in class, or there's more of a distinction that's needed between aspects of that, that's what I like to target on exams, to say, do you understand those distinctions? That's kind of the more vague or generic way of talking about. I like to target that. Something that is either commonly confused or it's easy to lump together and see it as a big whole. Can you separate that and understand the differences between those components or those pieces?
We talk about the difference between house rules and modifications or cultural layering here.
That's actually really difficult to place in a dynamic layer or a cultural layer. That was, I think we talked about that briefly in class of like does house rules come from a dynamic as you play the game in a runtime type environment, you become dissatisfied with how the rules affect your play. So you want to modify the rules so that the game that you're playing is more fun. That approach described in that way is more dynamic than cultural. But if you go to a game store, maybe it's our nearby neighbors and oh my gosh, what are they called? I have way too many game store names floating around in my.
GameStop.
No, the one just a couple blocks away. Sage's Portal. If you go to Sage's Portal and rent a game, or you can rent board games there. Let's say you go there and you see people playing a game and they're playing a game with house rules. And you look at that and you say, that looks like more fun than when I played the game. Now it's more of a cultural layer that because of an interaction you're having with other people playing the game, not while you're directly playing the game. So it's not dynamic coming from those rules, it's cultural. So the same idea could be placed in both the dynamic layer and the cultural layer, but it really depends on how you describe it as to whether it goes in one or the other or both.
Rules or modified rules on like a Discord or like shared them,
Yeah.
on a blog or whatever, and then other people start implementing your version of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, so the same idea could fit in both places. I will certainly be looking for your description at that point to say, is how you are engaging with this concept more dynamic or more cultural? But even with the same idea, you could get that completely right or completely wrong, depending on your explanation.
Thinking about house rules, I have a weird example that I thought of that I'm not sure if it counts as house rules, but everybody's played Uno. There's an online version of Uno that has different rules than regular Uno.
Yeah,
The online one was made by Ubisoft, so does that count as house rules that Ubisoft has published, or?
that sounds like a lawsuit that didn't happen.
What? I mean, they paid for they paid for the
Yeah.
rights to it, so it's.
Yeah, so then it would kind of be a commercial modification or it's kind of similar to if if a game company dies out and another company purchases the intellectual rights for it and then picks it back up, it'd be the equivalent of a show stopped airing on Sci-Fi and Netflix picked it up and continued producing the next couple seasons of it. It's different people making the same idea. Does it still belong to the same series? People would argue, yes, it does. It's supposed to be continuing the canon of that series. So I would argue that it is a game in that space, or it is a game in that, variation of Uno and its variants. So it's a developed variant by a different company. It's still in that same universe.
So relating it to the Tetra, it'd be more of an inscribed.
Yeah, you're changing the rules at that point.
Changing the basis of the game
Yeah.
versus it's merging from players having house rules changing.
Yeah, even if that may have been how it originated, which is again why this becomes so interconnected a little bit. We have to go talk to the developers of the adjacent game and say, why did you make this? Did it come from analyzing the rule, analyzing how people played this, and you wanted to make this and digitize this popular adjacent game with just a few modifications? Or did this stem from, we want to modify the rules to this and publish it as an adjacent game without really it coming from the experience of playing the game? One is more of a change of the inscribed layer, and one is using the dynamics of the game to go back and iterate on the inscribed layer. There's a lot of finicky details there, and I'll do my best not to punish people for going down that route. If it's not exactly what I think when I first read it, this is why the explanation will be very important. If you tie it to, this could be seen as this, but if it's done this way, then it could be seen as that. Then if it shows an understanding of the difference between inscribed and dynamic, then that's fine. Not really a place for me to argue with that. And as usual, I will be scouring answers and telling Hunter to scour answers to give points, not to take points away. So if it's there on the page, we're gonna be looking for it. But if it's there on the page and vague, and it could mean a few different things, then it's not on the page. We have to worst case and say, do they know this? Is the evidence there on the page that they know this? The answer is yes, they'll get credit. The answer is no, but we think you know it anyway. It's hard to get that credit. So make sure that you're concise, but you're descriptive. You avoid the use of vague words, vague concepts. Be specific.
Do you have any recommendations for somebody who's never taken one of your tests before?
This is probably as easy as they get, or as close to as easy as they get. For a class like this, I'm not trying to fool anybody. It really is just be prepared for critical thinking. Be prepared to, on the fly, come up with some ideas and be able to justify them. And to be able to do that, you need to know the material that we've covered to be able to tie it back to that. That's really there's gonna be no this or that where you're picking between answers and trying to figure out, is this answer better than that answer? Why? Like a multiple choice type of question. It's all going to be you generating your own critical thinking and putting it on the page. I think the best advice I can give is read the problem. Make sure that you've read the problem and you're answering exactly what the problem is asking. And there's no one right answer, so don't try to look for the right answer. But it is worth thinking about. Some examples will lead to shorter, more concise, better answers than other examples. So if some question on the exam were to say, choose a game that you have played. I don't know the games that you have played, but it may be that some games will better address the questions that question is targeting than another game. So don't just pick your favorite game, pick a game where it is easy to distinguish between the elements that the question is targeting. It's trying to target the difference between M and D and A. Don't pick a game that is where those are as close as possible to each other. They're still distinct, but it takes you 10 paragraphs to describe how and why they're distinct. Choose a game where the mechanics lead to the dynamics, lead to the aesthetics, and there's a big difference between those. And it's easy to describe that concisely. That one choice will save you a lot of time when it comes to actually explaining each of those answers to those questions.
Did you give us an example of a game of your choice and do the MDA of it very quickly?
Sure. So, easy example. I say don't pick your favorite game, and I'm probably about to state my favorite game because I do think that it has very good distinction between this, but I'll choose Path of Exile. Why not? The mechanics of Path of Exile are mostly hidden from the user. Things like the drop rates of particular items. How do things like the pack size in an area and the rarity of monsters in an area affect the total amount and the rarity of loot that drops? When you have a ton of systems like that that are independent, but they play together. So the mechanics are the code. How are monsters spawned in an area? How does that work? The dynamics now is the strategy of what do I have access to? How do I manipulate based on the elements that are in my control so that I can optimize how much currency I gain per hour? That is not something that is inscribed in the game rules. That's something that is emergent dynamic. And I can engage with that to the extent to which I want to. I don't have to do any of that optimization and I can still play the game. I can not play the game and think about it for hours or days, come up with a consensus in my mind about here's how I think I can optimize based on my own play style, what it is that I care about. That's all dynamic. That's emergent from the inscribed rules in the game. And then the aesthetics are when those big items drop, those high value currency items, those high value uniques. I am rewarded for the effort that I put in. So I'm looking at the aesthetic of, I feel like the work that I put in that is rewarded by the inscribed game's rules, allowing more things to drop, more higher value things to drop, which I can then go sell and put myself at a competitive advantage to other players or to myself. If I come up with an even better strategy, I can compare how effective was this last week when I had optimized it versus how effective is it this week when I've optimized it. I optimized it more. I'm stronger. I'm getting more drops. Does that make sense? So that would probably be the route that I would go because those are very distinct from each other. And it's very easy to talk about how my own strategizing about the rules is distinct from the rules. How I feel about the result of my strategizing is distinct from the strategizing itself. I strategize and then I experience the rewards of that strategizing.
So I kind of want to go into aesthetics a little more. Obviously, intuitively, when you think of aesthetics, you think of, like
visual.
Yes, exactly. But I know, like from our lectures, that's not necessarily always the case. But does the visual aspect play a part in it?
Yes. Yeah, it really is just how you feel. How do you feel when you're looking at gorgeous game art inside of a gorgeous setting, which with your graphics all the way turned up, or you put on a VR headset and you can see that, wow, this looks wonderful in a 4K VR setting. It's not just that the art is good, it's that how does that make you feel? Do you appreciate what you are looking at? But aesthetics extends beyond that to all of the senses, really. How do you feel about the game in general can lead to, for instance, I love watching numbers go up. Maybe that makes me some kind of monkey that just when a number goes up, I go. But it's a very exciting feeling. And even though that's not visual, that's something that I experience and is based on the dynamics. If I'm playing some kind of incremental game, the strategy that I use to make progress and watch that number go up makes me feel very similarly to someone who appreciates visual art looking at visual art. They see something that is not something they would have thought to create, is something that is prettier than anything that they've ever seen or more realistic than anything they've ever seen before. And like a monkey, they would also, whoa, this is so cool. It's the same feeling. So targeting why players play games is really the aesthetic for what is it that you're trying to get out of this game experience.
And the dynamics is essentially how you play the game with the rules, right?
Yeah, so what emerges from that? What kinds of strategy emerges from that? How do you interact with the rules to try to get that aesthetic feeling? If you enjoy, for instance, experiencing horror, how do you approach a horror game to try to maximize the effects of the atmosphere of the game? So that's how the dynamics of the game, how you choose to play. Do you sneak around? I don't know too many people playing a horror game who want to go in guns blazing at something, because it's just a different approach than the horror game is trying to get at. You're supposed to feel weak and vulnerable. If you treat that game like an action game, then you're not getting the full horror experience. If you design a horror game to kind of be an action horror game, then you're not leaning into the real horror aesthetic, which would be why people who enjoy jump scares or enjoy creepy atmospheres are playing the game. They want to take the time to soak in that atmosphere and not feel like they're powerful in that setting. They should feel like they have to be careful. They have to plan in advance. If something happens, get yourself in a situation where you can be successful, because death is right around the corner.
Is there anything on the exam you feel like we did not spend enough time in class covering?
It's a good question. I really don't think so. I think that if everything we talked about, if you've had a chance to really think about how has that affected me, how is that related to the games that I have played, if that's helped you to have a deeper appreciation when you do play a game, thinking about what makes me think the way that I think when I play that game, I think that kind of tie allows you to bridge the gap between everything we've talked about so far and really get an appreciation for, from the designer's perspective, how do you replicate that from nothing?
Flow, and then in the last one it mentions flow.
Yeah.
Can you give a little description on that?
Yeah, so flow was that two-dimensional, there's the difficulty of the game and there's the time that the user has put into the game. So as the user gets more and more familiar with the game and the mechanics, they're going to get more skilled. The difficulty of the game should also get higher to try to offset some of that learning that is happening so that it is still a challenge. That flow zone is what lies between frustration and boredom. On one hand, if the game is too difficult for your current skill level, that is frustrating. If the game is not difficult enough for your skill level, then it can be boring. Not necessarily, depending on if you're playing it for something other than the difficulty, but if you're trying to really have a player feel like they are challenged, then there's that bar in the middle that allows you to say there's a balance between that player skill and difficulty that allows you to say, yes, this player is having fun. And within that flow bar, there was that green smaller bar right on the edge where the player is being challenged, but it's on the easier side than the harder side. So if they work toward that, that allows them to feel powerful in the game environment. And a player who feels like they are powerful feels like the work that they put into it was rewarded. If their dynamics were to optimize the situation and that optimization has made them feel powerful in the game world, that is an optimal state of flow. They feel like by engaging with the game's mechanics, I was able to reach a point where I now feel like I am powerful. If you're fighting for your life in one game, I feel like I'm optimized and I'm barely able to get by. That is also sometimes desirable, but in certain genres or with certain people. Maybe in a horror setting, it feels like it took everything that I had just to survive. And that's valid in a horror setting, but it's less valid in an action setting, for instance. An action game, you want to feel powerful. The goal is to feel powerful, so it should be possible to feel powerful. Yeah.
I think Doom, like modern Doom, is like a really good like, quintessential example of flow.
Yeah.
Because like the way that they like make the game, it's not just like a hyper violent, like Like it is obviously, but they go beyond that, like, when they give you an ability. Like it is designed to do a specific thing, and if you engage with that mechanic, it makes the game that much easier and sends you into like what I would consider like literally a gameplay flow, where like when you damage enemies, you're able to like execute them, and that gives you health. But then eventually you run out of ammo, so then they give you the chainsaw that you can use that cuts down enemies and gives you ammo. But then when you do that, it runs out of fuel, so then you have to damage more enemies to get that. But then like you're also losing armor, which reduces your damage. So there's a way to get armor from enemies with another ability. And it just all cycles back on itself. So like if you don't utilize the mechanics, like if you're not flowing through them, then the game is that much harder for it. But then as soon as you engage with everything and you kind of master the idea of how to use them and in what order and when you should be using them, there's like this intrinsic flow that just feels really, really good about it.
Yeah.
And I don't think very many games are capable of achieving like quite like I feel like it strikes it like right in the middle, kind of in that green zone almost, as long as
Yeah.
you're engaging with those mechanics.
Right, but with the experience of someone who doesn't understand that.
Yeah, it's awful
It's,
sometimes.
yeah, it's very different. So from a design perspective, you will have to make sure the player is aware of that at a particular point. By the time that the player is supposed to be engaging with that mechanic, every player who plays your game needs to be aware of it, because if they're not going to have fun with it. But if it is embedded in a tutorial or reminders after the tutorial, because sometimes people play a tutorial, they go off for a day, 3 days, a week, life gets busy, they come back. Do they remember everything from the tutorial? So if there's some kind of reminder, it could be something written on a wall somewhere. It could be something that a character says in a dialogue, or something that shows up later that reminds you of something. That is a way of, if you remember it from the tutorial, great. It doesn't take you a ton of time. You can just ignore it. But if you didn't, then you're going to walk up to it and read it or engage with it in that dialogue that reminds you, oh, of course, I remember that from the tutorial. I'll remember to do that now.
Loading screen tips.
Yes, loading screen tips as well. Yep.
I really think your comment kind of leads into interesting design, because although Doom is an incredibly simple game, kill demons, get through the level. You know, that's a super simple idea. Yeah, so an interesting decision doesn't have to be this complicated idea or extremely unique game mechanic per se.
Yeah.
It just has to be interesting, the fact that it makes the game more engaging, is what I think. Interesting decision really boils down to.
Yeah. Should I do this or that? There are reasons that I might want to choose one or the other. And in that case, there certainly is. Do I continue with the chainsaw, or do I start to utilize my ammo? Do I, if that is an interesting decision, if there's a reason that you might want to choose one or the other, and depending on the current state of the game, that changes what you want to do, that becomes an interesting decision. If the game gives you so much ammo and guns are so much stronger than anything else in the game, then it's no longer an interesting decision. Do I use the guns or do I use the chainsaw? You have a near infinite supply of ammo and the gun's always better. Why is the chainsaw even in the game at that point? It's not an interesting decision anymore.
Can we talk about that same concept with a battle royale game? I feel like battle royales
Yeah,
act low because you have players that are gonna die right away. And then you have players that are probably going to win
yeah.
the
So
majority of the time, so.
ranking systems are very good for something like that, where if you're going to play in a battle royale, you don't want to open it up to everyone who plays that game at all sorts of skill levels, because then only the high skill levels are going to win. But you could have lower skill level, higher skill level, moderate skill level, have some kind of ranking system. We're actually going to talk about that later in the course and design our own ranking system to figure out how do you create one of those ranking systems for a multiplayer competitive game to be able to do matchmaking. And it's especially in battle royale, it's a big match. You're matching many players to the same instance of a game. You could also allow for, of course, promotion and demotion from those. You could allow or award different amounts of currency depending on your finish. If the goal of a character is to level up, maybe you do have a battle royale where you have some level 90 characters in with some level 10 characters. But then the goal of the level 10 character is find the level 8 character and kill them before the level 90 character finds me. If you do that and finish in 80th instead of 90th, you get more rewards. But because you're level 10, you level up faster than you do if you're level 90. So the level 10 who kills a single unit in that battle royale and levels up twice. The level 90 who wins it levels up 10% of a single level, if they're able to. So that way you can create different outcomes within the same battle royale for different players. Different players will have different objectives within that same battle royale.
I played Destiny for a while and that community is insane sometimes, cause like they'll be like, they have like mixed matchmaking. So skill levels of all types and people are like, with mixed matchmaking, it's too easy. Like, there's a bunch of people that don't know what they're doing, and so they're always losing on my team, or I'm always killing them all the time. And so a bunch of us like, okay, we hear what you're saying, we're gonna do skill-based matchmaking. So then they did skill-based matchmaking. Everybody's like, the game's too hard now, it's too sweaty. I'm playing with people that are exactly the same as me, I can't do this. And like, okay, we hear you, we're doing mixed matchmaking again. And then it's just like cycles. It like everybody's different at what they want, and it's really hard to just like balance around that.
Gamers are vocal, but they're only vocal when they're upset.
Yeah.
So no matter what you do, you're gonna hear the rah, rah, rah of a different proportion of the population who's upset with the current design.
Yeah.
Which again shows that you can't design something for everyone. So find your niche and make them really appreciate your game, as I think is basically what the solution is. Unless you want to make two different forks of the game, one that has one type, one that has the other, and then those who want to play in that particular setting can play in that setting. And if they don't like that setting, they can choose the other one.
Have like different playlists or something.
Yeah, different kinds of matchmaking
Yeah.
in different servers of the game. And that way you'd be climbing different leaderboards based on that. So you wouldn't be directly comparing people between the two different matchmaking algorithms.
No, I'm wondering.
Yep.
Maybe that's a global range system. Why am I part of a different one?
All right, we are out of time. I will have some time in my office. I'm meeting with one of my graders, but feel free to send me emails if you come up with further questions. Other than that, I will see you tomorrow for an exam.